Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and this is my guide to some insanely hard-hitting Fate Carver beam setups in the Elder Scrolls Online. I'm calling this build Herald of the Flame, and there are two variants of it that work great. It uses the Herald of the Tome and the Ardent Flame skill lines, and then for the third line, you can go with Assassination or Aedric Spear. Both of these are solid options, and I'll break down a little later why you might want to choose one over the other. Alduin got 158k DPS using this combo with the exhausting Fate Carver morph. I got almost 157k DPS using the safer Pragmatic morph. So in this video, I'll break down not only the top single target damage setups, but also a variety of other loadouts for different scenarios, including a starter gear setup for those without access to all of the top gear options yet. One last thing before we get started, I do have the written guide for this on my website at skinnycheeks.gg. For those that are fans of the Aedric Tome and Beam Machine setups from previous patches, these beam builds are also good to go for update 48 on the website and still work very well. In fact, for some scenarios in the game, I'd probably prefer them over the Herald of the Flame setup that we'll talk about here. Most of the build info is the same across all of these setups aside from the skill choice, but with all that out of the way, let's get into the build. For the base class, since the nerf of the Arcanist class mastery for the banner bearer skill, doesn't really matter anymore which base class you pick. You could use Arcanist or Dragonknight as your base class, or depending on what other skill line you go with, you could be a Templar or a Nightblade as well. These all can achieve the same top end results with this build. For our attributes, I think the build works best going all into stamina. This is mostly due to resource sustain. Having a higher stamina pool to work with is what I prefer. However, you can go with the Magicka build for this if that's what you prefer. You might have to make some tweaks to sustain that lower stamina pool a little bit better. So for this video, all of the gear will be presented with stamina glyphs, but if you do want to go the Magicka route, make sure to swap those over to Magicka glyphs. For the race options, Dark Elf is the strongest for organized group play if you are going the stamina route. Khajiit is just as strong if you're not in an organized group, but the 12% crit damage bonus they get can be wasted if you're over that cap of 125%. Then Orc is also a really great option. It's really only like 1% behind Dark Elf for damage, and they have a higher health pool, so that trade-off might be worth it to you. High Elf is my favorite if you're going the Magicka route. Not only do they get the most damage, but they also get the spell recharge passive. This gives some nice stamina sustain that helps out a lot since we generally have quite a few stamina costing abilities. And it also reduces our damage taken by 5% while we're channeling. Really, any race can do well and is not the limiting factor for being able to complete any difficulty of content as a damage dealer. Getting down the build and the rotation is way more important than which race you choose. For the Mundus Stone, 99% of the time, we will be going with the Thief. It's just the strongest all around if we are sitting near that crit damage cap of 125%. For the champion points, we're going Master at Arms, Biting Aura, and Wrathful Strikes as the main three nodes in the warfare tree. From there, if you're set on crit damage and you have off balance provided, Exploiter is the best fourth node there. Backstabber or Fighting Finesse are also prioritized over these here if you need more crit damage to hit that 125% cap. And then Reaving Blows is very nice for some extra survival if you don't have consistent healing. And then finally, Untamed Aggression is a nice fallback option if you're good on crit damage, but you don't have off balance going in the group. If you need a full champion point leveling guide, I have one here on YouTube. It will be linked down in the description below. For the food, basically I found that if I used Pragmatic Fate Carver, I could sustain the single stat or bi-stat options that have no recovery on them. But if I use Exhausting, I need to swap over to a recovery option. I definitely prefer bi-stat or tri-stat food for dungeons and trials, as the extra health helps a lot with survival, so I'll typically be going with the Pragmatic Fate Carver morph so I can do this. I do have a full list of different foods and scenarios you might use them on the Build Basics page of my site, and also each combat metrics sheet we'll go over later will show the food used at the bottom. For our potions, Tri-Stat Restoration Potions or Heroism Potions are the two most common that I'll use here. The Heroism ones are a bit expensive, but definitely help squeeze out a little more damage by allowing us to get our ultimates off more quickly. I also sometimes use the Resistance Potions to get a bit more defense. You have to be careful with these because you don't get any Magicka or stamina return on them, but for pragmatic setups, Sustain might be good enough to run these for certain content, making you a lot tankier. Like the foods, these potions are all listed on my website as well. Before we get into all of the skills, I figured some of you might be wondering if you should go Assassination or Aedric Spear with that third skill line. Well, let's break both of them down. Aedric Spear seems to be capable of a little bit higher single target damage. However, the Burning Light passive that contributes to a lot of the damage does not trigger in AoE. In addition to the bonus weapon and spell damage, Aedric Spear also gives a bonus to armor with the Balanced Warrior passive that you would not have access to with Assassination. Assassination has a ton of extra crit chance, which is great for both single target and AoE damage. The passive from slotting Soul Harvest offers an insane amount of ultimate generation in fights with lots of adds. This line also offers very good sustain for fights with lots of adds due to the Executioner passive. It says when an enemy dies within 2 seconds of being damaged by you, you restore 1000 Magicka and stamina. You also have access to the Hemorrhage passive, which gives you and the group even more crit chance if that's not already provided. But the skill line does fall off a bit for fights where you can't flank, as you lose 6.6% of your crit chance. Both of these lines offer extra critical damage, and both are very strong for DPS in general. I think the Assassination line is more versatile and the option I'd go with more often, but Aedric Spear is really great too and performed better for the trial dummy testing. Alright, let's go through the skills. With the recent nerfs to the Arcanist class mastery, Banner Bearer is no longer a must-run skill. However, if no one is providing this buff, it is still very good to have it. So if you're solo, it's really good. If you're in a dungeon group, I'd still have one of the DPS run this. And in a trial group, you'll want at least 2 people with banner since it only goes to 6 at a time. So we'll start out with the banner setups and then go through the non-banner ones afterwards. The first skill we have is Banner Bearer. For the focus, I'm typically going with Shocking for the direct damage increase or Magical for the magical damage increase. Remember, this covers magic damage, flame, frost, and shock. Shocking seems a little better for single target since it will boost Null Arca, but it's very close either way. Which one of these squeaks ahead will depend on the exact skill choice and gear choice that you end up with. For the signature, if you are a Templar or a Dragonknight, the class mastery is really good. The DK one falls off pretty hard for single target scenarios, but is insanely good for AoE scenarios, while the Templar one is just consistently good all around. If you are an Arcanist or a Nightblade class, or if you're a DK and planning on a single target scenario, the Cavalier's Charge signature is really good as well. If you are running Cavalier's Charge, then make sure to have the Celerity node slotted in the fitness tree, and ideally someone in your group providing at least Minor Expedition or some other kind of speed boost on top of that. I toyed around with slotting Concealed Weapon for Minor Expedition, but I found it wasn't worth it to drop any of the skills here. We just have really limited bar space. For the affix, this is really up to you and what your group needs. Minor Courage is a great way to go if that buff is not present. Minor Berserk is a bit more reliable to be getting from a healer in a standard group, but it can be run if you aren't getting this buff, or maybe you are getting it and Minor Courage is already covered, so you just want to make sure you have 100% uptime on that Minor Berserk. Minor Heroism can also be nice if you have Berserk and Courage covered. You don't want to use the expensive Heroism potions. Minor Resolve or Protection could also be decent if you're solo. You want to play a little more defensively. On the dummy, since I had most of the buffs already covered, I typically just used Intellect and Endurance to add in a little extra sustain. Really, there are lots of good options here, so up to you. For the next skill slot, we have a few options here: Barbed Trap, Quick Cloak, or Camo Hunter. For pure single target damage, I got ever so slightly more with Barbed Trap due to the extra weapon and spell damage from the Fighters Guild passive and the nice damage over time that it provides. We don't need the Minor Force from it though due to our gear, so this is a flexible slot. For most content, I'd probably run Quick Cloak here. The major evasion it gives is really good for survival, and the speed boost when you cast it is really nice too. The damage from the skill itself is not anything too great, but since it's a weapon ability, it does keep up your enchantments on your dual wield weapons, which is really nice since we are stuck channeling our beams so often. It helps fill in the gaps when we can't light attack weave. Then Camo Hunter is a great option too, as you get the Minor Berserk and the Fighters Guild passive, and it simplifies the rotation a bit. Camo Hunter is just a passive skill, and this one will not be cast. If you aren't using dual wield on the front bar, you'll have to go with Barbed Trap or Camo Hunter. Next, we have Venomous Claw. This is a really strong single target damage over time, and it has a long duration, so we don't have to cast it very often. It's also useful for keeping up our Seething Fury passive with Molten Whip, which we'll go over in a little bit. Next we have Cephaliarch's Flail. This is our Crux builder for Fate Carver, and it also applies a really nice 5% damage taken debuff to the target. This is only a personal DPS increase, it doesn't apply to your teammates. On top of that, it also has a really nice heal attached to it if you hit a target, so it's pretty good for survival too. Just an excellent skill all around and a must-have for this build. Next up is our main spammable Fate Carver. Pragmatic is the morph I usually go with as it's much easier to sustain and it provides a huge shield every time that you're channeling it. The damage is a little lower than the exhausting morph since it doesn't last as long, but I don't find it to be a big enough difference to warrant going with exhausting for most scenarios. Now all of that said, if you are pushing for the max damage possible, exhausting is the one you want to go with. As I mentioned earlier, Alduin did squeak out 158k with the exhausting morph, while I was just shy of 157k with pragmatic. Ultimately up to you, but I think for most players, pragmatic is the way to go. For the ultimate, this is really the main difference depending on if you go with Assassination or Aedric Spear. If you're going with the Assassination line, I recommend Soul Harvest here. Not only is it a really strong, low-cost ultimate to cast, but the ultimate generation from killing targets is insanely good. For 12-person trials, you won't benefit as much here as you do need to get that killing blow for it to generate the 10 ultimate, but it's still nice as it will trigger here and there. For solo or 4-person content though, it's insane ultimate generation. The other morph in cap is also solid if you're not going to be benefiting from the ulti gen, but I think Soul Harvest probably makes more sense in more scenarios. Having it slotted here on the front bar is also important to unlock our Nightblade passives since we need an ability slotted for some of those. If you're going with Aedric Spear, you'll slot Everlasting Sweep here, another strong low-cost ultimate that actually lasts longer the more enemies that you hit with it. The main reason we're slotting it here though is to unlock our Aedric Spear crit damage. If you are already over the crit damage cap, such as on the trial dummy, you could get better results running Flawless Dawnbreaker here since it gives another 3% weapon and spell damage from the Fighters Guild passives, and you don't need an Aedric Spear ability slotted for the Burning Light and Balanced Warrior passives. For most real content scenarios though, the 12% crit damage from the Piercing Spear passive is really nice to have and typically worth more than the 3% weapon and spell damage from the Fighters Guild passive. For the Backbar, we have the banner again. The skill has to be double barred to keep it active. Then we have our weapon skill, so Stampede if you're running a two-hander on the Backbar, or Elemental Blockade if you're running a staff. These are important not only because of the special arena weapons that we'll be running, which we'll go over in the gear later, but these also keep up our Backbar enchantment while you're on the front bar. And we'll also get into the easier dual wield backbar setup in just a bit. Next we have Inspired Scholarship or the Recuperative Morph. This skill is really a lot of great stuff in one. First, it gives us our major sorcery and brutality on both bars just for slotting it. Then while it is active, it can also deal damage every 3 seconds, which is triggered by dealing damage with a class ability, or every 5 seconds for the Recuperative Morph, which also returns resources each time it goes off. On top of that, if we don't have a Crux active, this will automatically generate one when the damage triggers. This is a huge DPS increase to only need to flail twice to get 3 Crux instead of 3 times. And the damage from the skill itself for both morphs is also very good. The Recuperative Morph actually has a higher tooltip on it, so even though it's only every 5 seconds instead of every 3 seconds, it's really not that far behind for damage, only around a 1k DPS difference for most scenarios. Overall, this is just another must-have skill. Next up, we have Flames of Oblivion. This is another must-have skill. The damage from it is insanely good, not just from single target, but it also fires out to 2 additional nearby targets too. And then similar to Inspired Scholarship, this also gives us a buff for just slotting it, except this is the Major Prophecy and Savagery for our crit chance increase on both of our bars. So with these 2 skills here, our major buffs are covered and we don't have to worry about sourcing those anywhere else. This also helps keep up our Seething Fury passive, which we'll talk about now. Molten Whip is not slotted here to be used as a spammable, but instead it's used for its passive feature, Seething Fury. This gives us an extra 300 weapon and spell damage as long as we're casting Ardent Flame abilities within a 15-second window. This is pretty naturally done at the start of a fight as we have Venomous Claw, Flames of Oblivion, and Standard of Might, but in between standards, you'll need to keep an eye on your Molten Whip timer and sometimes cast Flames of Oblivion early to keep the passive from falling off. This is a bit easier if we have another Ardent Flame skill slotted, which we'll go over in a bit with the non-banner setup since we have a little more bar space there. But with Banner Bearer taking up 2 slots, we don't really have room for it here. But the 300 weapon and spell damage is very impactful and a very nice DPS increase. Then finally, we have the ultimate, Standard of Might. This is one of the main reasons we use Ardent Flame. It's pretty much the strongest ultimate in the game for damage whenever you can build up enough to cast it. But it does have a high cost of 250. Not only does it deal really good damage in an AoE, but it also buffs your damage done and reduces your damage taken. Insanely good ult, and should be the poster child for what other ults strive to be. I'm looking at you, Nova. You really got to get it together. The only real downside to Standard is that it's stationary, so for highly mobile fights, it can fall off in effectiveness. These are the scenarios where I'd likely prefer to go with one of the other beam setups like Aedric Tome or Beam Machine, or for really short fights where the Standard doesn't really have enough time to be as effective. So yeah, I really like that different scenarios seem to be better suited for the different builds. And then one final note here, you can run Flames of Oblivion on the front bar and Claw on the back bar. There really isn't much difference. Claw will hit slightly weaker, but you also won't bar swap as much since Flames of Oblivion has a shorter timer than Claw. It's really up to you what you're more comfortable with. The results seem about the same either way. All right, for the non-banner setups, we are pretty similar here. On the front bar, we have room now for 2 out of the 3 of Quick Cloak, Barbed Trap, and Camo Hunter instead of just one of them. And then on the back bar, we have room for Engulfing Flames now, which helps keep up our Seething Fury stacks a lot easier. It's a decent dot, not anything too great on its own, but it does have a decent debuff to increase flame damage taken to the target as well. You are definitely not hard locked into Engulfing here though. This is a flex spot, so feel free to slot whatever you need for the encounter. Next up, we have the easier dual wield backbar loadout. This is a great setup for those that don't want to bar swap as much, as the backbar dots are all very long. 30 seconds on Quick Cloak and Inspired Scholarship, and 24 seconds on Venomous Claw. If you really want the rotation to go easier, you could just cast all 3 together when you're on your backbar every 30 seconds. This has a little lower top-end results from the two-handed version, but it's still very strong, especially for the rotation being much easier. And if you want to dive into some more skill bar options, make sure to check out the written guide at skinnycheeks.gg. All right, in this next section, we'll go over the gear. I will be covering quite a few set configurations here. If you don't want to swap gear around for different encounter types, then you can skip ahead to the all-around gear section, and I'll show some nice set and forget setups. I'll also have a starter section for those without access to all of the gear options as well. But for right now, let's start with some of the great single target focused setups. This first setup is the one that got me the highest results with the Assassination line. 2-piece Narayanth for the monster set, 5-piece Null Arca on the body, 4-piece Highland Sentinel on the front bar, the Velothi Mythic Amulet, and the Maelstrom Greatsword on the back bar. Running a 4-piece Highland is essentially like having Narayanth as your 5-piece bonus, and with how many direct damage ticks we are getting due to our beam, Narayanth procs very reliably. Very strong setup overall. As I mentioned, this was the highest I got with the Assassination line, but this also works very well on the Aedric Spear setup too. And just to be clear, all of these setups will work for all of the beam builds. This next one here seemed to be a little stronger on the Aedric setup though than the Narayanth version. I think that's because we have less overall crit chance without the Assassination line. So having the full 5-piece Highland gave a lot of extra crit chance to make up for it. So pretty similar setup here with this configuration. It's just a 5-piece Highland instead of 4-piece, and then a 1-piece monster set with crit chance on it instead of the 2-piece Narayanth. And then Null Arca is front barred since Highland Sentinel has to be active at all times or the buff falls off when you bar swap. And this next setup here is a great all-around single target damage setup. If you just want something that will work great for tons of different builds for single target bosses, you don't want to think about it too much, go with this one here. It's pretty similar again to the previous setups, except we'll be running a 5-piece Deadly Strike or Tideborn. Both of these are great options if you need the penetration line from Tideborn. That one can often squeak out ahead, but really you can't go wrong with either one here. All right, this next setup is very similar to the first one we went over with the 4-piece Highland, except we changed the 2 front bar weapons out for the Black Rose Prison dual wield set. This gives us a lot of extra defense, and the damage is pretty similar to running a 4-piece Highland. Another option with this setup, if you don't mind sacrificing a little bit of damage for some more defense, you can swap out the 2-piece Highland for a 1-piece Trainee and 1-piece Druid's Braid. These both give nice health bonuses, so close to 3k extra health for these versus the 3% crit chance for a 2-piece Highland. And then for those that prefer that dual wield backbar playstyle, we have some versions here that are tweaked for that. So here's the one with the 5-piece Highland. Here's the one for the 4-piece Highland and Narayanth. And then here is the single target setup with Deadly Strike or Tideborn. All right, next up, we'll go through the all-around gear setups. These are great setups for all types of fights, with or without secondary adds. And these are perfect if you just want a set and forget sort of setup that works well everywhere. If you're feeling overwhelmed with choices, you just want one setup to go with, this is the perfect option right here. 5-piece Ansel's Torment, 5-piece Deadly Strike or Tideborn, the Velothi Mythic Amulet, and the Maelstrom Greatsword or Staff on the Backbar. If you are going with the staff, Flame is generally preferred for group play, as off balance should be provided by a support role. If off balance is not present though, it can be nice to run the lightning staff so that you can apply that yourself. You can also run this setup with a 4-piece Highland and a monster set, either Narayanith or Prior Theeric. Narayanith's AoE is rather small, but it is consistent, whereas Prior Theeric covers a larger area, but it's a bit more bursty. Then we have pretty much the same setup, except dropping the 2 Highland Sentinel weapons for the Black Rose Prison Dual Wield again, roughly the same damage and a bit tankier than the previous setup. And then we have the Dual Wield Backbar versions again, this one for the 5-piece Deadly Strike or Tideborn, and then this one for the 4-piece Highland, Sentinel, and Monster set. And again, if we're moving too fast, all of these are available on the website as well if you need to reference them. Next, we have a setup for AoE Trash encounters. 5-piece Sulkzahn is still really great for that, and then 5-piece Deadly, Tideborn, or Gerency to pair with it. Gerency is nice if you need some extra penetration, as it has 2 lines of it, and the proc from this set hits really hard, but it kind of falls off if those pin lines are wasted. Then we have the same setup if you're running Dual Wield on the Backbar. And then finally for the gear, this section will be for those that don't have access to all the gear options yet. We'll start off with the new player setup and then work our way up from there. This one has 5-piece Tideborn and 5-piece Order's Wrath, both easy to get craftable sets. You can also do Deadly Strike if you have the gold to purchase it off of the traders. For the chest and the waist, we'll do 1 piece of the Trainee set and 1 piece of the Druid's Braid set for the extra health bonuses. These can be replaced once you get the Velothi Mythic and the 1-piece monster set like Slimecraw with crit chance on it. Next up, for those that have their Maelstrom weapon, the Velothi Mythic, and the monster set, this option here is for those that just don't have access yet to trial gear. So it's pretty similar, just pairing either Deadly Strike or Order's Wrath with Tideborn Wildstalker. Now, while this won't be quite as good as running a nice trial set like Null Arca or Ansel, it's really not too far behind, and having the rest of the build put together here, you're really most of the way there. And then finally, here is the Dual Wield Backbar version for those that prefer that playstyle. All right, for the next section of this video, I'll just run through some combat metrics reports showing the test results for several of these setups. I did all of my parses with the Pragmatic morph of Fate Carver, and the highest I got was with the Aedric spear line and using a non-banner setup. I was just shy of 157k DPS. I actually screwed up the rotation really bad at one point. I don't know if y'all will be able to tell when I show the clip later, but I was really mad at myself. Definitely could have been 158k if I wouldn't have messed it up. My crits were really good, so yeah, definitely beating myself up over that one. And then the gear used here is the version with the 5-piece Highland Sentinel set. This next one here is also with Aedric Spear, same gear loadout as well, but using the banner setup instead. Almost 154k DPS on this one. I used the recuperative morph of Scholarship, which added in enough sustain to not need to swap to the recovery food, but you could definitely use Inspired Scholarship and swap to Lavafoot and get similar results and better sustain overall. I do like to see what I can get away with not using recovery on the food here, because that gives me a decent idea of setups that I could run bi-stat food with in content. Next, we have another Aedric Spear Parse. This one uses the 4-piece Highland with the Narayanith setup. Pretty similar damage results here, but without Assassination, our crit chance is much lower, so you can see the results are kind of all over the place for crits, with Null Arca and Flames of Oblivion being only around 45%. It's definitely one of the downsides of not using the Assassination line. And then this is our last Aedric Spear Parse. This one at 150k DPS using the Black Rose Prison Dual Wield Backbar. Has great sustain, extra defense, and an easier rotation since the backbar dots are all very long. Just make sure to not activate your Quick Cloak until combat has already started, or you won't get that set bonus from it. I hate that that's how it works, but it is what it is. All right, now I have a few setups with the Assassination line. This first one here is with the 4-piece Highland and Narayanith. Fair bit lower than the Aedric version for single target damage. This could definitely break 150k though. I didn't spend as much time with it as I did with all of the Aedric parses. Then we have the same setup except with the recuperative morph instead of Inspired Scholarship. Only 1k less DPS overall, so pretty comparable, and sustain was better. And then we have this setup here that got to 146k DPS, pretty similar, except this one is with the Banner Bearer skill. And then for Alduin's Parse, I mentioned earlier, I'll let you guys check that out on his channel. I'll have the video linked in the description below. He got 158k using pretty much the same banner setup that I already showed, except he had the Exhausting Fate Cover morph instead of the Pragmatic morph. All right, that covers the test results, but stick around and I'll have several clips of the various setups in action on the trial dummy. And on the very first parse I show, I'll go through a few of the steps for opening up. Then after that, I'll just let them all play out. Thank you so much for watching. If this video has been helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the sub notification bell to be alerted to new videos. I'll be starting a subathon in December as well over on Twitch, so definitely stop by and say hey if you have a chance. Big shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Really appreciate the support. And a special thanks to these folks here. I couldn't keep doing this without you. All right, so for the opening rotation, getting things started, you want to make sure that you're full on ult, and then come over here. I have this side dummy set up. I'm going to make sure that my Crux are stacked to 3, and also my Seething Fury passive is stacked to 3. So hitting my flail, and then also doing Flames of Oblivion 3 times to get that stacked up. Then when we're getting ready to start on the dummy, I'm opening up with Inspired Scholarship, recasting Flames of Oblivion, and then right as I'm hitting my Quick Cloak, that's when I start running in. And doing this stops Quick Cloak from activating combat too early, since that only ticks every 2 seconds. So then after we run in, we drop Barbed Trap, swap to the back bar, hit Stampede, Venomous Claw, and then drop our ultimate. Go back to the front bar, hit Cephaliarch's Flail, and then beam. Then after the beam, I'm going to come back and apply Engulfing Flames. The reason I'm doing it this way is because I'm staggering my dots a little bit so that it's much easier to keep up the Seething Fury passive. It also, that opening off balance window, I want to get into that beam as fast as possible. So skipping Engulfing just lets me make sure a little bit more of my beam is landing in that opening off balance window. Then after that, it's essentially just keeping up the dots on their timers and then flailing and beaming. For the ultimate order, I open with the Standard of Might, I drop the Flawless Dawnbreaker in the middle, and then I do another standard towards the end. And you'll notice I have these little tables set up in front of the dummy. That's so I can run in place at the dummy. What this does, it helps you to weave Stampede so much easier. Stampede is a really weird skill because it's a gap closer. So if you are just standing perfectly still and you hit Stampede, a lot of times what happens is all of your skills will gray out on your bar. And so you won't be able to quickly or easily bar swap off of this skill cast or light attack weave into your next ability. So one solution to this is to do like a little wiggle with your character back and forth right before each Stampede. It will also solve that problem. But when you're sitting and parsing for hours and hours and testing lots of setups, it's so much easier to just have your character run in place, and then you don't have to worry about doing that. It's tedious. You don't have to mess with it. So this just makes things much more smooth and easy to work with. And so this is why you'll often see a lot of high-end parses using this tactic. It's really just to avoid the tediousness of having to wiggle back and forth every time you Stampede. And as I mentioned earlier, I did make a lot of mistakes on this parse, especially towards the end. I really screwed it up, but I think it could have been close to 160k if I had just done a flawless execution of the rotation. The crits were so good on this one. I was so mad that I messed it up. But anyways, this should give you a decent idea of how the rotation looks for the 2-minute fight. And yeah, if you have any questions, you can ask down in the comments below, or make sure to join our Discord server. It's a really good resource for people trying to get better at DPS, and I'll have that link down in the description below as well. But from here on, I'll just let the video play out with a bunch of different clips from different setups. See y'all later. Bye.